The courtroom was tense. A suffocating silence filled the air as the judge's gavel struck the bench, signaling the beginning of yet another hearing. But this wasn't just any case. This was a trial about police brutality, a subject that always managed to divide the room between those who believed in justice and those who hid behind the blue wall of silence. On one side of the courtroom, a woman sat with her back straight, her presence commanding, though she was met with looks of resentment and mockery. She wasn't just there as a witness, she was there to make sure justice was served. Across from her, leaning back in his chair, a white police officer smirked, his uniform crisp, his confidence unshaken. He had the audacity of a man who had spent years abusing his power and getting away with it. And to him, this hearing was nothing more than a joke. A black woman testifying against him? Laughable. He had seen it before. He had beaten cases before. And today wouldn't be any different. The prosecutor had barely finished his first question when the officer let out a chuckle, loud enough for the whole room to hear. The woman's eyes locked onto his, steady, unwavering. She wasn't intimidated. And that pissed him off. He wanted her to feel small. He wanted to remind her who had the real power in that room. Then, without warning, he grabbed his cup of steaming hot coffee, still fresh from the vending machine, and hurled it straight at her face. The dark liquid splashed across her skin, burning instantly, staining her blouse, dripping onto the polished wooden floor. Gasps echoed through the room. A collective shock spread among the spectators, but the officer? He just leaned back, arms crossed, a twisted grin on his face. "Oops," he said, voice dripping with mockery. "Guess I got a little too excited." The courtroom erupted. Lawyers jumped to their feet, the judge slammed his gavel, people shouted in outrage, but the officer just laughed. He had humiliated her, assaulted her, in a place meant for justice, and he wasn't even trying to hide it. "Come on," he sneered, shaking his head as if this was all one big joke. "What's the big deal? I thought you people liked coffee." The words hit like a slap. A cruel, racist reminder of what he thought of her, of all the people who looked like her. The courtroom was still in chaos, but she didn't flinch. She wiped the burning liquid from her face, her jaw tightening, her eyes narrowing, but she did not yell. She did not react. Because she knew something that he didn't. The officer smirked, turning to his lawyer. "This is what's wrong with the system," he said loud enough for everyone to hear. "They let these people come in here and pretend they're in charge." And at that moment, a single, controlled breath escaped her lips. Because he had no idea who he was talking to. He had no idea that the black woman he had just humiliated was not just some activist, not just another witness, not just another black face in the crowd. He had just thrown hot coffee on one of the most powerful women in the country. She was the chief of security for the United States. And what happened next would shock the entire nation. Because karma always finds its way home. And for him? It was knocking at his door. Before we dive into this powerful story, we want to take a moment to stand with our black audience. Plow of Twist does not support racism in any form. We believe in justice, dignity, and the power of truth. This story is not just entertainment, it's a reflection of the real struggles and triumphs that many face. If you've ever felt overlooked, disrespected, or underestimated, remember this: karma has no deadline. Now, sit back and enjoy the story. And if you support stories that expose injustice and deliver satisfying payback, make sure to subscribe to the channel. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a cold, artificial glow across the polished wooden floors of the federal courthouse in downtown Washington, D.C. The air smelled of old paper, coffee, and the unmistakable tension that lingered in places where power was debated and decided. This was not just any courtroom. This was a place where justice was supposed to be served, where people swore to tell the truth, where lives changed with the drop of a judge's gavel. But on that day, justice was just a word. A meaningless promise. Because in rooms like these, power often outweighed the truth. Sitting at the witness stand, Jordan Hayes remained composed. Every movement she made was deliberate, calm, collected, unwavering. She was a woman who had seen things, who had built herself from the ground up, who had stood in rooms filled with men who underestimated her and walked out leaving them stunned in silence. Jordan was not just a federal official. She was a leader, a woman who had spent her entire career fighting for security, justice, and the protection of those who had no voice. But in this room, she was not sitting as a high-ranking authority. No one here truly knew who she was, not yet. To them, she was just another black woman on the stand, someone they thought they could silence, dismiss, humiliate. Across the room, slouched in his chair as if he owned the place, was Officer Daniel Carter. He was everything Jordan had seen too many times before, a white cop with too much confidence, too much protection, and not enough accountability. His uniform was pressed to perfection, a badge gleaming over his chest, his belt loaded with the tools of a man who had spent years enforcing the law selectively. Carter wasn't nervous. Why would he be? He had spent his whole career knowing men like him walked away clean. How many times had he been in situations like these? How many times had a complaint been filed against him only for it to disappear? How many times had he laughed in the faces of the people he hurt? He leaned back, arms crossed, that smirk plastered on his face, his entire demeanor exuding entitlement. In his mind, this wasn't a trial, it was a formality. A public show to pretend like they cared. He had been through this before. He'd say the right words, his department would stand behind him, the union would protect him, and soon enough, he'd be back on the streets doing whatever the hell he wanted. Because he always got away with it. Jordan knew men like him. She had investigated men like him. She had spent years sitting across from law enforcement officers who thought their uniforms were shields, who thought they were untouchable, who believed the rules didn't apply to them. And now, here he was. Another name, another face, another case. But what Carter didn't know, what no one in that courtroom knew, was that this time was different. The case itself was supposed to be straightforward. Carter had been caught on body cam using excessive force on an unarmed black teenager. The footage was damning, a kid, hands in the air, compliant, and Carter still slammed him onto the pavement, still pressed his knee into his back, still used his baton when there was no threat. The boy's mother had wept when the footage played in court. The prosecution had presented evidence that should have made this an open-and-shut case. But anyone who had been in a courtroom like this before knew the truth: justice wasn't about evidence. It was about who the system was designed to protect. And the system had been protecting Carter for years. He sat there, knowing that all he had to do was wait for the jury to hesitate, for the judge to look the other way, for the people in power to do what they always did, find a way to justify his actions. He wasn't worried. Not when the court was filled with the same people who had let him off before. Not when the prosecutor wasn't pushing as hard as they should. Not when the jury had a convenient lack of diversity. Jordan had watched these proceedings countless times before. She had seen the same cycle, the same excuses, the same system working exactly as it was designed. But what Carter didn't realize was that his arrogance was going to be his downfall. Because while he sat there, laughing under his breath, thinking this was just another day of getting away with it, Jordan was calculating everything. And then, it happened. The moment that made the entire room stop. Carter, in a move so reckless, so disgustingly bold, grabbed his steaming hot coffee from the table and hurled it straight at her face. The liquid burned instantly, soaking into her skin, seeping into the fabric of her suit, dripping onto the pristine wooden floor like spilled ink on a judgment already written. For a split second, there was silence, the kind of silence that only exists when people are trying to process whether or not they actually just saw what they saw. And then, chaos. Gasps. Voices rising. Chairs scraping against the floor. The judge's gavel slamming down. Lawyers jumping to their feet. The courtroom spiraled into outrage, but Carter just laughed. He had done it so casually, so effortlessly, like it was nothing. Like she was nothing. And then, the words. The ones that set fire to the moment, the ones that burned worse than the coffee itself. Relax, Carter sneered, that smug grin stretching across his face. I was just trying to wake you up. You people always love playing the victim. He didn't care about the outcry. He didn't care about the disgusted looks. He didn't care about the judges shouting. Because in his mind, there would be no real consequences. He was so sure of it that he just sat there, arms crossed, amused. But across the room, as Jordan wiped the burning liquid from her skin, she didn't react. She didn't yell. She didn't break. She didn't flinch. Because she knew something that he didn't. The courtroom was still catching up, still processing the sheer audacity of what had just happened. But as Carter sat there, thinking he had just humiliated another black woman who couldn't fight back, he didn't realize that his life had already changed. Because Jordan Hayes was not just a witness. She was the highest-ranking security official in the United States government. And Carter had just thrown hot coffee on the wrong person. He didn't know it yet. But his time was up. The room was still charged with the aftershock of what had just happened. The judge's voice bellowed through the courtroom, demanding order, but there was no silencing the unspoken reality that hung in the air like smoke after a fire. The moment Carter's coffee had hit Jordan's skin, everything had shifted. Not just for her. Not just for the spectators. But for Carter himself, even if he was still too blind to see it. Jordan remained still, her fingers pressing lightly against her damp suit, feeling the heat fade into the cool fabric. She had spent years perfecting her control, mastering the art of staying composed when the world expected her to break. But beneath that measured exterior, a storm was brewing. She had been disrespected before. She had been underestimated. But never like this. Never so openly. Never with so much arrogance from a man who truly believed he was untouchable. Carter, still grinning like a man who thought he had won, leaned back in his chair, his voice slicing through the courtroom like a blade. Oh, come on. She's not actually hurt. Jesus, you people are so damn sensitive. It's coffee, not acid. His lawyer stiffened beside him, clearly aware that Carter had crossed a line so deep there was no walking it back. He nudged his client's arm, murmuring something through clenched teeth, but Carter just shrugged him off, never taking his eyes off Jordan. What? Carter's voice was mocking, loud enough for everyone to hear. She's looking at me like she's about to have me assassinated or something. Jordan tilted her head, expression unreadable, voice calm when she finally spoke. You think this is funny? Carter smirked. Yeah, a little. But I'm guessing you don't. A murmur of disbelief spread through the room. Even the other officers present in the courtroom, some of whom had once stood by Carter without question, shifted uncomfortably in their seats. They had seen plenty of cops get away with things. But this was different. Jordan exhaled slowly, shaking her head as she reached for a napkin from the table. She dabbed at her face, slow and deliberate, never once breaking eye contact. You have no idea what you've just done, she said. Carter chuckled. Oh, trust me, sweetheart, I do. I've pissed off another activist with a superiority complex. Let me guess, you're gonna start screaming about how I'm part of the system, how I'm a racist pig, how this whole country is out to get you. Spare me. You and I both know I'll be back on the streets before lunch. His lawyer let out a quiet curse under his breath, his hands gripping his notepad so tightly his knuckles turned white. But Jordan? Jordan just smiled. A small, almost imperceptible smile. One that made Carter's expression falter for the first time. You really think so? That was all she said. But it was enough to make something uneasy flicker across Carter's face for a fraction of a second. He didn't understand why, but something about her calmness unnerved him. Jordan turned her gaze to the judge. Your Honor, she said, her voice cutting through the tension like steel, I'd like to formally request that Officer Carter be removed from this courtroom immediately. His actions just now were not only a blatant act of disrespect but also an assault on a federal witness in a court of law. The judge, who had already been furious, nodded sharply. Bailiff, remove the defendant from my courtroom. The room erupted again. The officers standing in the back exchanged glances. Even Carter's attorney stiffened, his face draining of color. Because now, for the first time, Carter was actually in trouble. Not just for the brutality case. Not just for excessive force. But for what he had just done in front of dozens of witnesses, including the most powerful people in the city. Carter let out a laugh, this time less certain, less amused. Oh, you've got to be kidding me. Two bailiffs approached. Carter didn't move at first, his confidence wavering just slightly. You're seriously throwing me out? For coffee? Jesus Christ, what is this, a dictatorship? The bailiffs didn't respond. One of them grabbed his arm, and that's when Carter finally started to feel it, the tiniest crack in the shield he had always carried around himself. For the first time in his career, he was the one being escorted out. Not the ones he had beaten. Not the ones he had falsely arrested. Not the black and brown men and women he had brutalized. Him. And as they dragged him toward the door, he made the mistake of looking back. Jordan was still watching him, her posture unchanged, her expression still composed. But there was something in her eyes that sent a shiver down his spine. It wasn't anger. It wasn't even hatred. It was certainty. The kind of certainty that said, this isn't over. This is just beginning. And Carter, for the first time in his life, felt something he wasn't used to feeling. Fear. The moment he was pulled out of the courtroom, his attorney grabbed his arm, dragging him to the side before he could say another word. What the hell is wrong with you? His lawyer hissed. Do you have any idea what you just did? Carter rolled his eyes. Relax. This is all for show. They'll make a scene, let her play the victim, and then we'll settle this like we always do. Worst case, I get a paid suspension for a couple of weeks. His lawyer stared at him like he had lost his mind. You still don't get it, do you? He muttered, glancing over his shoulder, lowering his voice. Do you even know who she is? Carter scoffed. Some black lady with a chip on her shoulder. His lawyer's jaw tightened. He took a slow breath, his next words coming out with pure disbelief. She's Jordan Hayes, you idiot. Carter frowned. Okay. And who the hell is Jordan Hayes? His lawyer didn't blink. She's the chief of national security. Silence. For the first time, Carter's smirk disappeared completely. His lawyer watched as the realization started to settle in, as Carter's entire body stiffened, as he replayed the last few minutes in his head with a new, horrifying clarity. And then, the final blow. His lawyer stepped closer, voice barely above a whisper now. You didn't just throw coffee on a witness, he said. You assaulted one of the most powerful women in this country. And if you think for 1 second that she's going to let this slide, you're dumber than I thought. Carter's mouth went dry. And for the first time in his life, he had no words. Because suddenly, this wasn't just another case. This wasn't just another hearing. This was something he had no control over. And he had no idea what was coming next. The ride back to the station was suffocating. Carter sat in the back of the police SUV, his mind spinning faster than he could control. The reality of what had happened, of what he had done, had sunk in like a heavy stone, pressing down on his chest. The confidence he had earlier, the smugness, the certainty that this was just another minor bump in his otherwise untouchable career, it was gone. In its place was something unfamiliar. Something Carter had never truly felt before. Dread. He had assaulted the chief of national security. He hadn't just insulted some activist, hadn't just thrown coffee on some nobody. Jordan Hayes was one of the most powerful figures in the country, a woman with connections that reached the highest levels of government, a woman who could crush him with a single phone call. And he had laughed in her face. His lawyer had gone silent after breaking the news to him, staring out the window with a tension that made Carter's stomach twist. Every turn of the car felt heavier, every streetlight casting eerie shadows over his growing paranoia. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. He was supposed to be out by now, already working his way through the usual PR cleanup, already getting reassurances from his department that they'd smooth things over like they always did. But there had been no calls. No messages from his captain. No support from his fellow officers. Nothing. And that terrified him more than anything. The car pulled into the underground parking lot of the precinct, the overhead fluorescent lights flickering slightly as they rolled to a stop. Carter swallowed, his throat dry as the officers in the front stepped out without a word. He expected them to turn around and let him out, but instead, they stood there, exchanging unreadable glances. Carter's gut twisted. "What the hell are we waiting for?" he muttered. Neither officer answered. Then, as if on cue, another black SUV pulled up beside them, its dark-tinted windows reflecting the harsh white lights above. Carter's breath hitched slightly. He recognized that kind of car. He had seen them before. Government vehicles. The back door opened, and she stepped out. Jordan Hayes. She was still dressed in the same navy blue suit, though now it was perfectly clean, as if the coffee had never touched her skin. As if what he had done hadn't even fazed her. But it wasn't just her presence that made Carter's pulse quicken, it was the way she looked at him. Not with anger. Not with satisfaction. With certainty. Jordan stepped forward, her heels clicking sharply against the pavement as she approached the SUV. The officers standing beside the vehicle immediately stepped aside, their postures almost too stiff, too professional. Carter clenched his jaw, forcing himself to hold her gaze as she finally spoke. "Get him out." The officers moved without hesitation, opening the door and yanking Carter out by his arm. He tensed at the sudden force, but the look on their faces told him this wasn't personal. They weren't treating him like one of their own anymore. They were treating him like a liability. Jordan took a slow step closer, too calm, too composed. "You know," she said, tilting her head slightly, "I've dealt with a lot of men like you." Carter let out a sharp breath through his nose, forcing a scoff. "Oh, yeah. And what exactly am I?" Jordan's expression didn't change. "Weak." A flicker of something dark passed over Carter's face. Weak. It was a word that cut deeper than he was willing to admit. Jordan didn't wait for a response. She turned to the officers standing beside him, giving a simple nod. "Take him inside." Carter clenched his jaw. "I'm not under arrest." Jordan's lips twitched in amusement. "Aren't you?" The word settled like poison in his gut. He turned to his lawyer, expecting him to step in, to argue, to do something, but the man only gave a small shake of his head. "Just go inside," he muttered. "Trust me, you don't want to make this worse." Carter's pulse pounded against his skull. Make this worse? How the hell could it get worse? But something in his lawyer's voice, something in the way everyone was treating him, told him he didn't want to find out. The walk through the precinct was nothing like before. The officers at their desks, the ones who had once greeted him with nods and smirks, barely looked at him now. No one spoke. No one met his eyes. It was as if he had already been erased, as if they had already started distancing themselves from a sinking ship. They led him into an interrogation room, a room he had sat in countless times before, but never on this side of the table. The realization made his stomach churn. The door shut behind him. Jordan sat down across from him, setting a single manila folder on the table between them. She didn't open it. Didn't even glance at it. Just placed her hands neatly over the cover and stared at him. The silence stretched. Carter swallowed. What the hell is this? Jordan finally leaned forward, resting her elbows on the table, her voice dropping just slightly. This, she said, tapping the folder, is everything you've ever gotten away with. Carter's throat went dry. Jordan tilted her head. Tell me, Officer Carter. How many complaints have been filed against you? His jaw tightened. I don't know. 37. The number hit like a punch to the gut. Jordan's eyes never left him. 37 formal complaints. Excessive force, misconduct, falsified reports. All buried. All wiped clean. All conveniently ignored. Carter forced a smirk, but his fingers twitched slightly against the table. And? That's not illegal. I've been cleared every time. Jordan exhaled slowly, leaning back in her chair. That's true. You have been. But do you know what happens when someone like me starts looking into someone like you? Carter didn't respond. Jordan opened the folder. Photos. Documents. Evidence. She slid a single photograph toward him. A picture of a young black boy, bruised, his eye swollen shut. Jordan's voice was quiet now. Controlled. This was your last victim, she said. The one that landed you in court today. Carter's throat tightened. She pushed another photo forward. This time, of a woman, her arms wrapped around the boy, tears staining her face. His mother, Jordan continued. Do you know what she said to me after court today? Carter's fingers curled into fists. She said she wasn't surprised. Jordan's gaze darkened. She said she never expected justice. A beat of silence. Jordan leaned in, voice just above a whisper now. But here's the thing, Carter. She smiled. This time, she's going to get it. Carter's pulse roared in his ears. And for the first time in his life, he had no escape. Carter's breathing had become uneven. He could feel the walls of the interrogation room closing in around him, the weight of the evidence before him pressing against his chest like an anvil. His fingers twitched on the table, but he forced himself to keep his expression still. He couldn't let her see him crack. He wouldn't give her the satisfaction. Jordan watched him with an unsettling calm, her fingers drumming lightly against the manila folder. She had seen this before, the denial, the false bravado, the desperate clinging to an illusion of power. Carter had spent his whole career believing that the rules didn't apply to him. That the shield on his chest made him invincible. That he could do whatever he wanted and walk away untouched. But this time, he wasn't the one in control. Jordan tapped the folder again, her eyes never leaving his. You're quiet, Carter. That's not like you. Carter clenched his jaw, his voice tight. This is bullshit. I'm not answering anything without my lawyer. Jordan smiled, slow and knowing. Oh, he already left. That made his stomach drop. He looked toward the door, expecting to see his lawyer pacing outside, ready to storm in and put an end to this. But there was no one. Jordan leaned forward. He knew when to walk away. Shame you don't. Carter's lips parted slightly, but no words came out. His lawyer had abandoned him. His department had stopped answering his calls. And now, he was sitting across from a woman who had the power to dismantle everything he had built, and she was taking her time doing it. Jordan slid another paper toward him. It was an official document, thick with signatures. I'm sure you're wondering what this is, she said. This is a direct order from the Department of Justice. As of this morning, you are no longer an officer of the law. Carter felt his entire body tense. That's impossible. Jordan exhaled slowly, tilting her head. Is it? Carter snatched the paper up, his hands gripping it so tightly the edges crumpled. His eyes scanned the words, but his vision blurred with rage and disbelief. This is illegal, he muttered, his voice cracking. Jordan raised an eyebrow. You sure about that? Carter slammed the paper onto the table, his voice rising. You don't get to do this. Jordan didn't flinch. Actually, I do. And I did. Carter's chest heaved, his mind racing. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. This was supposed to be like all the other times, some meaningless hearing, a slap on the wrist, a few weeks of desk duty before getting back on the streets. Not this. Not total and complete obliteration. Jordan sat back in her chair, crossing her arms. You're processing it, I can see that. Let me help you. You're not just fired, Carter. You're being investigated for criminal misconduct. Every single case you were involved in over the last 10 years is being re-examined. The ones that were swept under the rug. We're digging them up. The people you arrested. The ones you brutalized. We're reaching out to them. The families you tore apart. They're coming forward. Carter's pulse pounded against his skull. You're ruining my life. Jordan's gaze sharpened. You ruined your own life. I'm just making sure you finally face the consequences. Carter gritted his teeth. You think you're some kind of hero? You think taking me down changes anything? The system will eat you alive just like it does everyone else. You're not special, Hayes. You're just another black woman who thinks she can play in a game that was never designed for her to win. Jordan's lips pressed together in a thin line. She had expected him to lash out, to reach for whatever ugly, racist, venomous thing he could throw at her. Men like him always did when they lost control. But she didn't react the way he wanted. She didn't get angry. She didn't yell. She just smiled. You're right, she said. The system wasn't designed for me to win. She let the words settle before continuing, her voice lowering. But the difference between you and me, Carter. I didn't need the system to give me power. I took it. And now, I'm using it to take you down. Carter's nostrils flared, his hands shaking slightly as he gripped the edges of the table. Jordan reached into the folder and pulled out one last document. A grand jury indictment. His name was printed in bold at the top. Carter's breath hitched. Jordan tapped her fingers against it, her voice dangerously smooth. This is what you're going to be charged with: felony assault, obstruction of justice, and a federal hate crime. Carter's vision blurred for a second. A federal hate crime. Jordan leaned in, her words slow and deliberate. That means no state trial. No friendly judge. No police union bailing you out. No deal that lets you walk away clean. She tilted her head slightly. It means prison, Carter. Federal prison. Carter shook his head, his chest rising and falling rapidly. This is insane. You can't do this to me. Jordan arched an eyebrow. Oh, but I already did. Carter shot up from his seat, his chair scraping violently against the floor. This is personal, isn't it? You want revenge. That's what this is about. Jordan didn't move. Didn't blink. Just let him spiral. Carter's breath came in sharp bursts. This isn't about justice. You don't give a damn about justice. You just want to see me burn. Jordan exhaled slowly. I don't need to set the fire, Carter. She gestured toward the folder. You did that all by yourself. Carter opened his mouth, but no words came out. And then, before he could even process it, the door opened. 2 U.S. Marshals stepped inside, their expressions unreadable. Jordan straightened her posture, giving a curt nod. Take him in. Carter stumbled back, his hands shaking. Wait, the marshals grabbed him, their grips firm, unyielding. Carter thrashed. Panicked. No. No, this isn't happening. You can't do this. I'm a cop. You can't. Jordan stood slowly, smoothing the front of her suit. She looked down at him, her voice calm. Not anymore. Carter's face twisted in desperation as they dragged him toward the door, his shouts growing more frantic, more broken. Please. I can fix this. I can make this right. Just tell me what you want. Jordan tilted her head, considering him for a moment. Then, she gave a small, knowing smile. I already got what I wanted. Carter's pleas became screams as they pulled him through the doorway, the sound of his voice fading as the door slammed shut behind him. Jordan exhaled, rolling her shoulders back. The weight of it all, the justice that had finally been served, settled in her chest like a steady heartbeat. It was done. She turned toward the window, staring out at the city beyond. Because for the first time in her career, she had witnessed real justice. And it had never tasted sweeter. The corridors of the federal building stretched out endlessly, bathed in the harsh fluorescent glow that cast long shadows against the polished floors. The distant hum of conversation and the occasional shuffle of papers were the only sounds breaking the oppressive silence. But despite the routine activity of the agents and officials moving through the building, there was an unmistakable weight in the air, a shift that everyone could feel but no one dared to speak about openly. Something had changed. And that change had a name, Daniel Carter. Jordan Hayes stood near the observation window, her posture composed, her eyes fixed on the hallway where Carter had been dragged away only moments earlier. The echoes of his protests, his desperate attempts to fight the inevitable, still lingered in her mind. It wasn't the sound of a man standing his ground. It was the sound of a man who had finally realized that the world he had built for himself was crumbling. And there was nothing he could do to stop it. She had waited for this moment for years. Not Carter, specifically, he was just one of many. A symptom of a much larger disease. But every single time she had witnessed men like him escape accountability, every single time she had watched their crimes get brushed under the rug, every single time she had been forced to swallow the bitter truth that justice was an illusion designed to comfort those who would never truly receive it, it had led her here. To this moment. To this reckoning. And yet, as she stood there, watching the aftermath of everything she had orchestrated, there was no satisfaction. Agent Thomas's voice pulled her from her thoughts, his tone laced with something between amusement and disgust. He's already trying to make a deal. Jordan didn't turn to face him. She already knew what was coming. It was predictable. Pathetic, but predictable. Of course, he is, she muttered, her eyes still fixed on the hallway. Thomas stepped closer, his expression tinged with something resembling disbelief. You should hear how fast he folded. The guy barely made it through the processing room before he started naming names. He let out a dry laugh, shaking his head. And get this, he actually had the nerve to ask for immunity. Jordan finally turned, arching an eyebrow. Immunity? Thomas smirked. Yeah. Like he actually thinks we'd let him walk away from this. Jordan exhaled through her nose, a slow, measured breath. It wasn't surprising. Carter had spent his entire life protected by a system that had never forced him to take responsibility for anything. Why wouldn't he believe he could talk his way out of this? He had been conditioned to think that there would always be a way out, that someone would always step in to clean up his mess. That accountability was something that only applied to people who looked nothing like him. What's he offering? She asked. Thomas handed her a thin file, his lips pressing together. Other officers. Internal cover-ups. A list of people in the department who've been helping guys like him skate by for years. He paused before adding, some of the names are, high up. Jordan took the file, flipping it open with steady hands, her eyes scanning the contents. A list of names, each one heavier than the last. Some of them were people she had suspected for years but had never been able to pin down. Others were names she hadn't expected, names that made her stomach tighten with the weight of what this truly meant. This isn't just about Carter, Thomas said, watching her closely. This goes deep. Really deep. Jordan's jaw tightened. I know. Thomas hesitated, then lowered his voice slightly. And you know what's gonna happen next, right? She did. This wasn't just a case anymore. It was a storm, and she was standing directly in the center of it. Carter's downfall wasn't just about him, it was about everyone who had protected him, everyone who had enabled him, everyone who had turned a blind eye while he brutalized people under the false guise of law and order. And now that he was desperate, now that he had nothing left to hide behind, he was trying to drag them all down with him. Jordan closed the file, her grip firm around the edges. Are we taking it seriously? Thomas exhaled, nodding. DOJ is already opening investigations. Internal Affairs is getting involved. But you know how this works. They'll take down a few, just enough to make it look like they're cleaning house. Then they'll let the machine keep running. That was the part that always left a bitter taste in her mouth. No matter how many battles she fought, the war never seemed to end. She could remove Carter. She could remove every name on that list. And still, there would be another wave, another generation of men just like him, ready to step into the void and continue the cycle. The system always found a way to protect itself. Thomas shifted, studying her expression. You okay? Jordan didn't answer right away. She glanced back toward the hallway, where the distant murmurs of agents working late filled the silence. The weight of it all pressed against her ribs, but she had learned to carry it long ago. I will be, she finally said. Thomas didn't seem convinced. You don't look like someone who just won. Jordan let out a slow breath, her voice quieter now. Because this isn't a win, Thomas. It's survival. And I'm tired of just surviving. Thomas didn't argue. He understood. The door to the observation room opened, and another agent stepped inside, handing Jordan a thick, official-looking report. She flipped through it quickly, her eyes moving across the text, absorbing the confirmation of everything she already knew. The indictment against Carter had been finalized. The charges were official. His career was over. His name would forever be associated with corruption, brutality, and disgrace. His fall from power was absolute. And yet, the weight in Jordan's chest didn't lift. Because she thought of the victims. The families who had spent years waiting for justice. The ones who had stopped believing it would ever come. Would this be enough for them? Would they finally feel like someone had listened? Or would it just be another reminder that justice always came too late? She closed the folder, handing it back to the agent, her mind already shifting to the next steps. Thomas was watching her carefully. What happens now? Jordan straightened her posture, smoothing the front of her suit. Now, she said, her voice even. We see how deep this rabbit hole goes. She turned and walked out of the room, her heels echoing against the floor like a ticking clock. Because this wasn't the end. It never was. The sound of distant footsteps echoed through the sterile, linoleum-lined hallways of the federal building, the hum of whispered conversations barely audible beneath the rhythmic tap of Jordan Hayes' heels. The weight of everything, the months of work, the years of watching men like Carter walk free, the burden of carrying justice on her shoulders, settled deep into her bones. She wasn't exhausted, not physically. But there was a weariness beneath her skin, one that only came from fighting a war that never seemed to end. One man had fallen, but the machine still turned. And she knew, deep down, it always would. She reached the secure conference room, where a group of senior officials and prosecutors sat around a long, polished table. Some were flipping through documents, others staring at their screens, tension lining their faces. The room smelled like burnt coffee and paper, like exhaustion and urgency. Thomas stood at the far end, arms crossed, watching as she entered. His face gave nothing away, but the stiffness in his posture told her enough. She didn't sit. She didn't need to. She had learned long ago that power was about presence, about knowing when to take up space and when to make others feel small. And right now, as they all looked at her, waiting for direction, she was the most powerful person in the room. A younger prosecutor, his suit crisp, his tie a little too tight, cleared his throat, hesitating before speaking. Carter's officially in federal custody. He's still trying to negotiate, still throwing out names, but, he glanced down at the file in front of him. It's a mess. The more he talks, the uglier this gets. Jordan exhaled through her nose, slow and steady. Define ugly. The prosecutor hesitated before sliding a document across the table toward her. He's naming people in Homeland Security. The FBI. Even DOJ. Some of these names. They're not small players. She picked up the document, scanning the list. Some of them were expected, corrupt officers she had been monitoring for years, people with enough complaints against them to fill an entire floor of archives. But others made her stomach tighten. Thomas leaned in, lowering his voice. He's burning everything down with him. Jordan tapped the edge of the document against the table, thoughtful. He thinks if he gives up enough names, he can cut a deal. The younger prosecutor nodded. And the scary thing is, he might not be wrong. Jordan's eyes snapped up. Explain. The prosecutor shifted in his seat. Carter is guilty, no question. But if he's got enough dirt on the right people, if he gives us names that lead to bigger arrests, there's a chance someone higher up decides he's more valuable as an informant than a prisoner. Silence stretched through the room. The implication was clear. After everything, after the months of building this case, after everything he had done, Carter might still find a way to survive. Jordan's jaw tightened, her grip on the paper stiffening. That's not happening. Thomas leaned against the table, watching her carefully. You sure about that? You know how this town works, Jordan. Power protects itself. If it comes down to taking down Carter or taking down half of federal law enforcement, you think they're gonna choose him? Jordan's voice was like steel. I don't care what they choose. Carter doesn't walk. The room went still. For a long moment, no one spoke. The weight of her words pressed down on every single person at that table. Because she wasn't just talking about a case anymore. She was talking about a fight bigger than any of them. Thomas sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. Okay, so let's say we don't let him cut a deal. What's the move? Jordan placed the document down, straightening it with precision. We make sure the public knows exactly who he is. Every case he's covered up, every name he's protecting, every crime he's committed, we bring it all to light. We take away his leverage. The younger prosecutor hesitated. That could be dangerous. Jordan met his gaze, unwavering. More dangerous than letting him walk. The room fell into silence again. Thomas let out a slow breath, nodding slightly. All right. We go public. One of the older officials, a man who had spent decades in politics, frowned. You realize what this will do, right? This isn't just about Carter anymore. If we start naming names, if we expose how deep this goes, we're not just taking down a few bad cops. We're dismantling entire systems. Jordan's eyes darkened. Good. The man shook his head. Jordan, this isn't just some righteous crusade. You start pulling at this thread, and it's going to unravel everything. People are going to push back. Hard. She didn't blink. Let them. Another official sighed, rubbing his temple. And what about you? You think they'll just let you do this? You think there won't be consequences? Jordan let out a quiet laugh, but there was no humor in it. There have been consequences since the day I started this job. If they think they can scare me now, they're too late. Thomas studied her for a long moment, then gave a slow nod. All right. Let's move. The room burst into motion. Phones buzzed, documents were passed, orders were given. And just like that, the fight got bigger. Jordan turned, stepping toward the door, but before she could leave, Thomas spoke again, his voice quieter this time. "This isn't over, you know." She paused, glancing back. "I know." Thomas tilted his head. "So what happens when Carter realizes he has no way out?" Jordan's expression didn't change. "Then he'll finally understand what it feels like to have no power." She walked out without another word, her heels clicking sharply against the tile. And somewhere, deep in a cold, windowless interrogation room, Daniel Carter sat alone, his hands cuffed to the table, the weight of his own downfall crushing him from every direction. For the first time in his life, no one was coming to save him. The dim glow of the overhead light cast a dull sheen on the metal table in front of Carter. His wrists, raw from the too tight cuffs, ached as he shifted in his seat. The coldness of the room seeped into his bones, but it wasn't the temperature that made him shiver. It was the silence. The kind that stretched long enough to make a man start thinking. Long enough to force him to sit with the weight of everything that had happened. Everything that had unraveled in the past few hours. He had spent his entire career believing that nothing could touch him. That no matter what he did, there would always be a way out, a shield to protect him, a system that would bend before it broke. But now, there was no shield. No escape. No one coming to fix this for him. The door creaked open, and Carter tensed, his body going rigid. He expected a lawyer. A superior officer. Someone with enough rank to tell him that this was all a misunderstanding, that they would get it sorted out. But that wasn't who walked through the door. Jordan Hayes stepped inside, her movements deliberate, unhurried. She was not a woman who needed to rush. Not anymore. The game was already over, and Carter had lost. She pulled out the chair across from him, lowering herself into it with a quiet grace that made his stomach twist. She folded her hands on the table, looking at him with a calm that was almost unbearable. Not anger. Not gloating. Just certainty. Carter's fingers twitched against the cool metal of the cuffs. He forced himself to meet her gaze, but there was no power behind it anymore. Jordan tilted her head slightly. "How does it feel?" Carter scoffed, his voice rough from hours of silence. "How does what feel?" Jordan's lips twitched, just barely. "Losing." Carter exhaled sharply through his nose, his jaw tightening. "This isn't over." Jordan blinked slowly, as if amused. "I think we both know it is." Carter shook his head, a bitter laugh escaping him. "You think you've won because you got me locked in a room? Because you managed to turn a few suits against me?" His voice was hoarse, but it carried that old arrogance, the one he had relied on his entire life. "You really think they're gonna let you burn the whole system down? You think the people in power are gonna let this go any further than me?" Jordan leaned back, studying him. "You sound like a man who still believes he's important." Carter's nostrils flared. "I know how this works. They'll offer me up, throw me to the wolves to keep the machine running. But they won't let you take it apart." He exhaled, shaking his head. "You think you're changing something, but you're not. You're just another person playing a game that was rigged before you even got here." Jordan let the word settle. She had heard it before. The same tired argument from men who had spent their lives thriving in a system built for them. The same justification for why nothing would ever change. But Carter didn't realize something, he wasn't the one explaining the rules anymore. She leaned forward slightly, her voice lower now. Sharper. "You're right about one thing. They'll use you as a sacrifice. They'll pretend you were an isolated case, another bad apple, and they'll do it to protect themselves. But here's what you don't seem to understand, Carter." Her eyes darkened. "I don't need to burn the system down. I just need to make sure everyone sees exactly what it is." Carter's jaw clenched. Jordan tilted her head. "You spent your career making sure that people like me knew their place. Making sure they understood that no matter what, you were the one in control. Her fingers drummed lightly against the table. How's that working out for you now? Carter swallowed hard, but he didn't respond. Jordan let the silence stretch between them before speaking again, her voice softer now. You want to know the real reason why you're here? Why none of your people came running to save you? Carter didn't move. Jordan exhaled, watching him carefully. Because for the first time, you weren't worth saving. The words landed like a punch to the gut. Carter flinched, barely, but Jordan saw it. You were useful when you could keep the machine running, she continued, her voice unrelenting. When you could help them keep people in check. But now? She shook her head. Now you're just another liability. Another name they can use to prove that the system works, that accountability exists, without ever actually changing anything. Carter's breathing had grown shallow. Because she was right. Jordan let out a quiet sigh. And that's what's really eating at you, isn't it? Carter swallowed. Jordan tilted her head slightly. For the first time in your life, you know what it feels like to be disposable. Carter let out a slow, shaky breath. You think you're different? You think they won't turn on you just as fast? Jordan smiled, but there was no warmth in it. They already have. The difference is, I was ready for it. Carter let out a short, humorless laugh. Then why are you still playing their game? Jordan leaned in just slightly, her gaze steady. Because I don't play to win, Carter. Her voice dropped lower. I play to change the rules. Carter's throat worked as he swallowed again, for the first time looking truly lost. Jordan studied him for a long moment, then finally leaned back in her chair, tapping her fingers against the folder in front of her. I have to say, though. I always wondered how you'd react and the tables finally turned. Carter's lips pressed together into a thin, tight line. Jordan stood, smoothing out her suit. Now I know. She turned toward the door, placing one hand on the handle before pausing. Enjoy prison, Carter, she said without looking back. And then she was gone, leaving him alone in the cold, windowless room. For the first time in his life, Daniel Carter had nothing left to say. The air inside the federal courthouse was different now. Lighter. Charged with something unspoken but undeniable. Justice had been served, but the world had not stopped turning. The machine had not crumbled overnight, and no single man's downfall could erase the damage that had been done. But for once, for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, something real had changed. Jordan Hayes stood near the courthouse steps, her posture steady, her hands tucked neatly into the pockets of her coat. She watched as reporters scrambled, cameras flashing, voices overlapping in a chaotic frenzy. The entire nation had been watching the case, waiting to see if Carter would escape like so many before him. But today, the world had seen something different. They had seen accountability in its rarest form. Inside the courtroom, Carter had sat motionless as the judge delivered the final ruling. Convicted on all charges. His face, once smug and self-assured, had been stripped of every ounce of confidence. The man who had once wielded power so recklessly, who had laughed in the face of justice, had been reduced to nothing more than a statistic, a prisoner awaiting sentencing. And that sentence would be severe. The system that had protected him for so long had finally turned its back, not because it wanted justice, but because it needed to protect itself. Carter had become a liability, a sacrificial piece in a game much bigger than him. And now, he would spend the rest of his days behind the very walls he once used to cage others. As he was led out in handcuffs, flanked by federal agents, Carter's eyes had locked onto Jordan's. There had been no words. No more bravado. No more arrogance. Just a hollow, empty stare. Because he understood, finally, what she had known all along, power was never permanent. Jordan exhaled, glancing at her watch as Thomas approached from the courthouse doors, his expression unreadable. He stopped beside her, his hands slipping into his pockets. For a moment, they stood in silence, watching the scene unfold before them. The chaos. The noise. The victory that felt both monumental and incomplete. Thomas let out a quiet chuckle. Well, that was satisfying. Jordan smirked, tilting her head slightly. Was it? Thomas shrugged. The bad guy goes to prison. The hero walks away. It's what people want, right? Jordan exhaled slowly. And yet, the system that made him possible still stands. Thomas studied her, then nodded slightly. You're not wrong. But today? Today, you won. She considered that for a moment. Winning. It wasn't something she often allowed herself to think about. Victory was fleeting in her world, too often tainted by the knowledge that there would always be another battle, another fight waiting just around the corner. But today? Maybe today was enough. She glanced at Thomas. You sticking around? Thomas smirked. Nah. I think I've done my good deed for the year. Maybe I'll go fishing, live a quiet life for a bit. He paused before adding, what about you? Jordan turned her gaze back to the courthouse, her expression thoughtful. I keep moving. Thomas nodded, as if he had expected nothing else. He hesitated, then extended his hand. Jordan eyed it for a second before shaking it. No grand speeches, no unnecessary words. Just an understanding. This was the job. This was the life. And neither of them would stop until the work was done. As Thomas walked away, Jordan turned back to the flashing cameras, the shouting reporters, the questions she had no intention of answering. She had never been interested in fame. She didn't want a headline. She wanted change. And change didn't happen in front of cameras. It happened in the quiet spaces, in the decisions made when no one was watching. She took one last look at the courthouse, then turned and walked away. Because the fight wasn't over. It never would be. But for today. For today, she had won. And now, let's talk about what this story really means. How many times have we seen men like Carter walk free? How many times have we watched the system bend to protect those in power, while leaving the people they hurt to fend for themselves? Justice, real justice, isn't about a single case. It's not about a headline or a single conviction. It's about changing the way power works, changing who gets to decide what justice even looks like. Carter thought he was invincible. He thought the system would always be there to catch him when he fell. But here's the truth, power isn't something you're given. It's something you take. And the moment you think you can't lose it, you've already lost. So let me ask you, how many Carters do you think are still out there? And more importantly, who's going to bring them down? If this story made you think, if it made you feel something, then make sure to subscribe to Tales of Twist and hit that notification bell. Because the fight for justice isn't just in the stories we tell. It's in what we do next.